At 0240 local time above the Tatarstan steppe, a formation of propeller-driven drones drops out of cruise altitude and levels off over the rooftops of Nizhnekamsk, a refinery town of 240,000 people that most Russians couldn't find on a map. They have been flying for hours, since before midnight, since before the last checkpoint on the Ukrainian border passed 1,200 kilometers behind them. In 4 minutes, one of them will not hit the refinery its mission planners aimed it at. It will hit a hostel full of migrant construction workers from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and by morning, Tatarstan's governor will declare a day of mourning for the deadliest strike Ukraine has landed on Russian soil in 4 years of war. This is the story of how a $55,000 machine built out of plywood and composite reached deeper into Russia than almost anything Kyiv has fired before, why the people who died never worked a single shift at the plant it came for, and why Moscow can't stop the campaign that's now bleeding it dry one refinery at a time. Nizhnekamsk sits about 800 kilometers east of Moscow, deep enough into Russia's interior that for the first 2 years of the war its residents watched this conflict on television like everyone else. It's a company town built around Tatnef's TANECO complex, one of the newest and most technically advanced refineries Russia owns, with a nameplate capacity north of 16 million tons of crude a year, better than 300,000 barrels a day, feeding gasoline, diesel, and petrochemical feedstock into a national fuel system that has spent the last year quietly running out of slack. Ukraine's general staff had already put drones over this exact refinery once before, back in the spring, damaging processing equipment that Tatnef could only partly replace because half the components on a plant this modern are foreign-made and now sit behind sanctions. That earlier strike was a warning shot. This one wasn't. Ukraine's military said afterward it had struck TANECO again, deliberately, as part of a campaign it has been running almost daily since last summer against the refineries that keep Russian vehicles, aircraft, and armored columns fueled. What changed this time is what else the formation hit on its way in. The workhorse behind this kind of mission is a drone most people outside the defense press have never heard of, built by a Ukrainian company called Firepoint that didn't exist as a weapons manufacturer before the invasion. Its founders were a film location scout, an IT entrepreneur, and a man who used to run a concrete business. In November 2022, they started building something called the FP1 with about a dozen people in a workshop, and by the summer of 2026, that same company was turning out roughly 200 long-range strike drones a day. The FP1 is a one-way attack aircraft, not a reusable platform. A slender fuselage with a 2-cylinder engine turning a pusher propeller, straight fixed wings, and a solid rocket booster that throws it off the rail before the engine takes over for cruise. Depending on how the mission planners load it, it carries a warhead between 60 and 120 kilograms and flies anywhere from around 1,000 kilometers up past 2,700, because Firepoint engineers found they could trade payload for fuel by moving the tank into the wing structure itself, freeing up fuselage space without touching the airframe's basic shape. At roughly $55,000 a unit, it is delivering strike effects that used to require a cruise missile costing 20 or 30 times as much, and Ukraine's own general staff has credited the type with more than half of the country's confirmed long-range hits over the past year. It navigates without relying on GPS the way older loitering munitions did, because Ukrainian engineers learned early that Russia would simply jam or spoof any satellite signal a drone trusted, so newer generations lean on inertial guidance updated by terrain and visual reference, the same basic trick American cruise missiles have used since the 1970s, shrunk down onto circuit boards a few $100s each. That's what let this formation cross 1,100 kilometers of Russian airspace, past the coastal jamming belts and the surveillance radars that Ukrainian strikes have spent 2 years systematically burning out, and still find a specific rooftop in a specific industrial town it had never physically seen before that night. Russia's defense ministry said its air defenses intercepted more than 450 drones over Russian territory and annexed Crimea that same night, a number that sounds like a victory until you realize what it actually describes. Russia doesn't run a unified national air defense screen the way Western militaries imagine one. A blanket of overlapping radar coverage watching every square kilometer of sky. It runs point defense, batteries clustered around specific high-value sites, oil terminals, air bases. The approaches to Moscow, with enormous gaps between them because the country spans 11 time zones and there simply aren't enough interceptor systems to cover it all. A formation flying deep and low can thread those gaps, and the ones that get shot down over open country don't matter to the mission planners in Kiev nearly as much as the ones that get through to a target list built weeks in advance from satellite imagery and open source tracking of what each refinery actually produces. 450 intercepted drones in one night is not evidence the system is working. It's evidence of how many machines Ukraine is now willing to throw at Russian territory in a single push, confident that even a strike rate under 10% still puts warheads on the targets that matter. What makes TANECO worth that expenditure is what it does for the war Russia is fighting 3 years past when most analysts expected it to end. Since Ukraine ramped up this bombing campaign against Russian energy infrastructure in earnest last year, it has hit refineries and fuel depots in dozens of separate strikes stretching from the Black Sea coast to facilities more than 2,000 kilometers past the Ural Mountains. By the summer of 2026, Ukraine's own general staff was claiming more than 40% of Russian refining capacity had been knocked offline at one point or another, while the International Energy Agency's independent estimate put sustained losses above 20%, cutting roughly 500,000 barrels a day out of a system that used to run near full tilt. The consequences show up first at the gas pump. More than a dozen Russian regions have imposed rationing, some limiting drivers to 20 or 30 liters a fill, banning jerry cans outright, while Moscow itself has watched its largest single fuel supplier, the Kropotnya refinery, go offline twice in 1 month, with officials privately telling reporters it won't be fully repaired before the end of the year. Russia has responded by banning gasoline exports outright to protect domestic supply, importing fuel from allies to plug the gap, and watching its oil product export revenue slide to its lowest point in months even as crude exports climb to compensate. None of that stops tanks from moving or aircraft from flying. Not yet. But every liter of diesel that has to be trucked in from somewhere else instead of refined at home is a liter that costs the Kremlin more, arrives slower, and reminds ordinary Russians in ways television coverage never could that this war has a domestic price tag now measured in Qs. The part of this story that made international headlines wasn't the refinery at all. Reporting out of Tatarstan in the hours after the strike described drones hitting industrial and civilian sites across Nizhnekamsk that night, and one of them came down on a hostel housing foreign laborers, the kind of low-cost dormitory building that construction and industrial towns across Russia lean on to house the migrant workforce that keeps plants like TANECO staffed and expanding. 9 of the 13 people killed died in that one building, most of them citizens of Uzbekistan, with Tajik nationals also among the dead, and a child was counted among the victims across the wider attack. Uzbekistan's own consular office in the region confirmed 7 of its citizens were killed, which turned a strike aimed at Russian refining capacity into a diplomatic story touching 3 separate governments, none of which are formally at war with each other. Ukrainian officials, through the head of the country's Center for Countering Disinformation, defended the broader campaign afterward by arguing that facilities like TANECO manufacture weapons components and directly support Russia's ability to keep fighting, without directly addressing the hostile. Whether that particular building was ever meant to be part of the target set, or whether a drone missed its aim point by enough meters to turn an infrastructure strike into the deadliest single attack on Russian soil in 4 years of war, is the kind of question that gets fought over in press statements for weeks and rarely gets a clean answer. What's certain is the arithmetic underneath it. At $55,000 a unit and roughly 10% of a large formation actually reaching a target, drones flying inertial and visual navigation over a town they've never seen at night don't carry the kind of precision that makes a promise like industrial site only easy to keep. Tatarstan declared its mourning period the same Monday morning the fires at TANECO were still being put out, and Rustam Minnikhanov, the region's head, called it what Russian officials call every strike like it, a terrorist attack on civilian infrastructure, opening a criminal case that will accomplish exactly nothing against a drone campaign being run from workshops 1,000 kilometers away, that Russian investigators will never reach. President Zelensky, days before the strike, had already posted publicly that Russia was beginning to feel the consequences consequences of the refinery campaign, and that it would continue regardless of the ongoing stalled effort to bring mediators back to the table. Whatever leverage this campaign is supposed to buy Kyiv at a future negotiation, the immediate math on the ground in Nizhnekamsk is simpler and colder. One refinery damaged and repairable within weeks, one fuel market a little tighter than it was the day before, and 13 people in a company town most of the world had never heard of who had nothing to do with the war that killed them. There's a second story hiding underneath the diplomatic one, and it's about distance itself. 2 years ago, a strike 1,000 kilometers into Russia was the kind of thing that made international headlines on its own. A demonstration that Ukraine could reach targets far outside artillery range using improvised, GPS-guided airframes cobbled together on tight budgets. TANECO sits roughly 1,100 kilometers from the nearest stretch of the Ukrainian border, and by the time this formation crossed into Tatarstan airspace, it had already been flying longer than most commercial passenger routes across Europe. That kind of reach used to be the exception in this war. By the summer of 2026, it had become routine, with Firepoint's own engineers pushing the FP1's range envelope past 2,000 kilometers and confirming strikes on refineries in Tyumen and Omsk, both of them deeper into Russian territory than Nizhnekamsk, both hit within weeks of each other using airframes built around the same basic architecture that flew into Tatarstan. What used to require a purpose-built cruise missile costing millions of dollars and years of development now gets assembled on a production line turning out roughly 200 units a day, at a unit cost cheaper than a mid-range car, and flown by a targeting process that increasingly treats all of Western and Central Russia as reachable ground. That shift changes the math for every refinery manager, every regional governor, and every air defense officer in the country, because a target list that used to shrink at the horizon now effectively doesn't shrink at all. It also explains why Russia's response keeps landing on the same handful of blunt instruments: export bans, rationing, quiet diplomatic requests for imported fuel from partners like Belarus and Kazakhstan, and public statements insisting refining runs are being managed even as independent tracking from the International Energy Agency tells a colder story about capacity that simply isn't coming back online on the timeline Moscow promises. None of those tools touch the actual vulnerability, which isn't a shortage of interceptor missiles or radar coverage in the abstract, it's geography. A country spanning 11 time zones cannot wall off every refinery, every fuel depot, and every satellite ground station behind a wall of point defense batteries dense enough to guarantee a 100% intercept rate. And Ukraine's mission planners know that better than anyone, because they've spent 2 years mapping exactly where the gaps sit. If you want to see how far this campaign has already reached inland, and how one strike walked past every layer of Russia's coastal defenses to hit the ground station running an entire satellite constellation, go watch the video on Ukraine's attack on Dubna next. Bye for now.